right, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Paco. And thanks to the organizers for having me here. I'm excited to tell you about streaming machine learning in Spark. So I am actually a neuroscientist, though I do a lot of stuff with analytics in Spark, as well as visualization. And I want to start by just highlighting a bunch of the people that have been involved in this work. I have the great fortune of working with a really diverse group of people. I'm highlighting some of them here that were most involved in what I'll be describing. Nick down there is the only neuroscientist on the board. This is a pretty cool mix of both developers working with me and my group, Andrew and Yasha, Matt, who's working on visualization, but then we've also been doing a lot of work with Jean-Gris and TD from Databricks on the sort of Spark development side. So this has been a very fun confluence of people with a pretty diverse group of mix of skill sets. I think everybody here is familiar with the concept that a lot of data arrive in streams. So one you might be maybe used to thinking about is that if you have users or whatever, people from different locations, and you have data coming from them over time, and it's evolving over time, your data is changing. Data is dynamic. It's not fixed. The case that we're particularly concerned about, and that we think about a lot, is the brain. And we have a variety of technologies now in neuroscience where we can monitor neural activity on the fly. So we do this by genetically engineering animals so that their neurons literally light up when they're active through reporters of calcium activity, genetically encoded reporters of calcium activity. I'm showing here a movie where we're watching neural activity in the brain of a mouse. We also do these experiments in the zebrafish. And with these technologies, we can sort of literally watch neurons as they're active, watch patterns of activity during experiments, and use that to learn about how the brain sort of does all the amazing things that it does. Now, one of the challenges of this kind of data and doing these kinds of experiments is that we obtain these measurements of neural activity at a very fast rate. These are high-resolution images. And because people are developing amazing technologies, we can do this over more and more and larger chunks of the brain simultaneously, in some cases like the zebrafish, over the entire brain of the animal. So this requires that we come up with sort of clever ways of working with the data. And in particular, we are very interested in ways of analyzing these data on the fly, so that we can take, for example, a streaming movie like this and be analyzing the data and looking for patterns while we're acquiring the data and visualize those patterns, because that's going to let us do targeted manipulations. It's going to let us change the experiment. It's going to let us go in and sort of zap individual neurons or target them for manipulation. So that's what we're trying to do. For a long time now, we've been using Spark to do a lot of the analytics that we do on these data. More recently, we've started to use Spark streaming to let us do the analysis on the fly. Now, as you've been hearing about today, there are a couple really, so Spark Streaming is a fantastic technology, and MLlib is also a fantastic library for doing a lot of analyses. And we do a lot of analyses using algorithms that are built into MLlib. But something that we started working on a few months ago was to try to come up with better ways of linking these two things together. Because in a lot of machine learning sort of analysis problems, you want to be fitting models to your data as you're acquiring the data and have those models update over time, so you can be sort of watching and learning about what the patterns in the data are as you're acquiring it and make sort of more targeted decisions, or in our case, sort of experimental manipulations. So it turns out in a lot of cases, it's reasonably straightforward to get something like Spark Streaming and MLlib to talk to each other. And to walk through that, I just want to do a really high-level sort of overview of what this kind of algorithm or analysis update looks like. So there's definitely no math in this diagram. It's a little bit, very abstract. But it sort of highlights basically what's going on in a lot of streaming machine learning cases. So on the left is data. It's a bunch of data points. It could be anything. And doing analysis, doing machine learning, is basically taking your data and doing some kind of fitting procedure, which for here we'll just be totally abstract about. And what we get out of that fitting procedure is a model. And there's a lot of complexity in how to actually do that. But at the end of the day, that's sort of what we're doing. So it turns out in sort of machine learning, there are a lot of analyses and algorithms where you don't actually have to do that initial fitting on the entire data set at once. And it actually has been shown in a number of cases to be potentially beneficial to do your analysis or your fitting on chunks of the data separately and then gradually update the model over time. So that would look a little bit more like this, where we start with some chunk of the data, we do some fitting, we get a model, and then we start fitting on another chunk of the data, and we update our model, and then we do that again, and we keep updating our model based on different chunks of the data. So for k-means clustering, for example, there's something called mini-batch k-means that does this, and it's actually proven a useful way before there were things like Spark. If you wanted to fit a model to a big data set, but you couldn't load the whole thing into memory. You could sort of sequentially load chunks of it and fit your model. Anything based on stochastic gradient descent can operate in this regime. So this is a useful way to update models on the fly, and there's a lot of nice math for how to do this. Well, if we just add a time axis on the left, actually, it should be going the other direction. Sorry about that, because usually we start at the beginning. But if we think about time as controlling when these data are acquired, then we can now think about doing our analysis in a streaming fashion. So we acquire data at one time point, we fit our model, and then when we acquire data at the next time point, we can use an analysis of that data from that time point to update our model and continue to update the model as we acquire more and more data. And if you focus on the, does this thing work? Maybe not. What's going on over here at this stage, you can be clever about the math for the update rule so that as you get new data, instead of just replacing the model with the current one, you can, for example, combine the past and the future in a way that causes the model to slowly change over time as opposed to rapidly. So you control how fast the model is adapting to what's coming in the data. So that's the overall schematic for what these algorithms are going to look like. In Spark, as of Spark 1.3, we have implemented 3 different algorithms in a streaming fashion. So we have streaming k-means, streaming linear regression, and streaming logistic regression. And again, this was done in collaboration with Jean-Gris and TD. And these are available. They're experimental, but I encourage you to check them out. And what I'm going to do now is walk through with some visual examples what these algorithms look like. So to give you a sort of sense, an intuitive sense of what it is to do streaming clustering, streaming regression, streaming linear regression, or logistic regression. In showing these examples, I'm going to be using a visualization library that we developed. This is with Matt Conlin, who's working with us. He's here in New York. And I want to very quickly just talk about this library. It's called Lightning. That's what that purple Lightning bolt is for. And Lightning is a server-based visualization framework. So the Lightning server is the thing in the middle of this diagram. And it renders visualizations using a wide variety of existing, as well as new, JavaScript-based visualization technologies, things like 3.js for 3D, D3 for 2D visualizations. And it sits in the middle of, on the one hand, on the left, how you pass your data to it. So it has a REST API. We can publish data to it either from an arbitrary source like the brain directly, or measurements of the brain. But we also have a client in Python. There's a client in Node. We just recently released an early version of our Scala client. So this now becomes a visualization library you can use with a lot of different languages. And then after posting data to the Lightning server, it renders visualizations in a browser in a way that's very easy to share or distribute or interact with. And a big focus of Lightning is coming up with new kinds of interactive visualizations. So partly due to the nature of our data, we deal with a lot of complicated stuff, time series, graphs, lots of kind of rich, interesting visualization problems, especially problems where we really need to have interactivity in the way we do our analyses. And we want to look at visualizing streams of data. So we built this for that. It's an open source library. I encourage you to check it out. And that's what we're using to do the streaming visualizations that I'm about to show. So we're going to start with streaming k-means. And I'm showing here, just sort of for reference, a very brief description of what the code actually looks like to call streaming k-means from within Spark. This is as of Spark 1.2. So you start off by declaring a model. And each of these streaming algorithms has a couple sort of pretty simple parameters to specify. So in the case of streaming k-means, you have to say how many clusters you want ahead of time. That's how to do that dynamically is sort of a separate problem. We're thinking about that, but don't have a solution. So you say, I want 3 clusters. We have a concept of a half-life. So remember I said when you're updating a model over time, you can sort of determine how to weight the future and the past so that you can update either quickly or slowly as the data come in. So that's what the half-life is going to control, sort of how fast is the model going to change. And finally, we initialize with some random centers, because if you're just getting your data for the first time, you don't know where to start. So you start with something random. Once you've created your model, then you can train on a input dstream, which is going to be your data source. And this can be coming from anywhere. So it could be from Kafka or a bunch of text files, really wherever you want. Any sort of valid dstream created within Spark Streaming can be fed directly into the model training. And then you can also predict on another dstream. And that could either be the same data that you're training the model on, or you could predict on a different dstream in a different set of data. So you could be, say, training your model and updating it on one data source and then predicting on another data source. So let's look at a couple examples of what this looks like in practice. These examples are going to be deliberately simple. They're all two-dimensional and one-dimensional with very few data points. That's just to illustrate sort of fundamentally what's going on here. Of course, they all scale and can be used on more complex data. So I'm showing here both a one-dimensional and a two-dimensional example. Let me sort of walk you through what's going on here. In each of these plots, the colored lines are the data that we're acquiring over time, and the black lines, either the lines or the black points, indicate the currently estimated centers of our clusters. So on the left, we're doing k-means clustering with 5 clusters, and on the right, we're doing it with 4 clusters. So over time, the data is changing. The data on the right is sort of moving up and down. It's waving around. And on the left, the clusters are sort of wiggling around a little bit. And what you can see is that, first of all, the black lines or circles are at the center of the clusters. But also, as the data move, the clusters move as well. So the model is not static. It's not just sort of we learned it once. We're actually just updating the model as new data come in. All right? So now I want to show examples that illustrate some of the more kind of different behaviors you can get and some of the things that you can control in these algorithms. So here, again, a sort of deliberately simple example. In both of these cases, we have a setup where we're doing k-means clustering with 4 clusters, and the data is changing partway through the fitting procedure, or partway through the data acquisition. So at the beginning, the centers are all at one location, and then halfway through, they all move away. This could be suddenly your data source changes, and your people or brains or neurons or whatever, suddenly everything changes, and now the data is coming in differently. So I remember I said we had that half-life parameter. This lets us control how fast the data or the model is going to update based on changes in the data. And on the left, that's set so it's going to update really rapidly. But on the right, it's set so it's going to take a while. So in the plot on the right, you see these black dots sort of slowly drift towards the new centers, whereas on the left, they jump right there. And depending on how quickly you think you're getting your data is changing and what kinds of changes you expect, you may or may not want to set this parameter in different ways. So we give this kind of flexibility to control the half-life. To see that in a little more of a sort of simple, even one-dimensional example, I'm showing basically exactly the same thing here, except because it's in 1D, it's very obvious what happens. You have these 2 clusters, the purple and the blue, and then partway through, they both change to new positions. And when the half-life is short, that black line sort of immediately tracks to the new location. But when the half-life is longer, it takes longer, and it sort of slowly drifts to the new position. All right, so again, these are sort of very simple, just sort of get some intuition about, in this case, what the half-life controls. A final cool feature that we added to the streaming clustering is a concept of dying clusters. So sometimes if your data change really dramatically, it may be that, hopefully not, no one actually died, but a cluster, some data source just suddenly goes away and it doesn't exist anymore. And you want to kind of control for that and somehow work around it. So what's going on here is the cluster at the top just completely drops out. And for a couple steps, the algorithm sort of gets stuck because it thinks there's something there and there's not. But then after a couple steps, it knows to basically get rid of that cluster and break the other cluster in 2, so it can now adapt to what is a new sort of aspect of the data source. So this is a dying cluster mechanism, and you can control the threshold at which that's going to happen. All right, so that was streaming k-means. I want to just show now one example each for streaming logistic regression and streaming linear regression. These demos are going to be similar, and again, sort of similar, sort of simple examples just to get intuition. For streaming logistic regression, you set up the model in a very similar way. You have some initial weights. You have things that are more common to these linear or sort of linear methods, things like a step size, because this is a gradient-based method, as well as the number of iterations per batch. So those are the kind of parameters you can control. And here we're seeing a demo where we're doing logistic regression. So we're predicting data that's either 0 or 1, and it varies along the x-axis. And the points are colored based on what the model thinks the prediction was. Green is 1, and blue is 0. And the position of the data is what the data actually is. And the big dots are ones that are being predicted accurately, and the little dots are ones that are not being predicted accurately. And again, like the other examples, we're changing the source of the data halfway through. So at the beginning, the blue points down below, let's wait for it to start again, are on the left, and up top, the green points are on the right, and they're all big because the model's doing well. Now right here, the data change, they actually flip, so there's a lot of little points because we're doing kind of crappy, but then the model adjusts itself and now starts predicting the points better again. Because the model is basically just updating as the new data come in, so when the data change, it's wrong, but then it's right again because it's updating based on the new data. All right, and a final example, very similar to that, is the example of streaming linear regression, which again has parameters like the initial weights and the the step size, as well as the number of iterations. And again, we can watch a similar behavior. Here, there's no color. I'm just showing the data points, x versus y. We're doing linear regression, so you can basically think we're just fitting a line. And the size, again, of the data points indicates the mismatch between the prediction and what they actually are. So we want the data points to be small. And at the beginning, when the thing was angled this way, all the data points are small. And then halfway through, the model change, or the source of the data changes. So instead of being in this axis, now the data are like that. And when that first happens, the data points on the edges are really big because the model's doing really badly, because it was trained, or it thought it was trying to predict this, and then we swapped it, and it's not doing very well anymore. But once it adapts, now the points are small again because the model's doing better, because it's learned to adapt to the new data. All right. So that's streaming machine learning stuff that's built in now to Spark. It was sort of added over the course of Spark 1.1, 1.2, and 1.3. I encourage you to check it out. What we're using this stuff for is neuroscience. Again, that is properly what I am. And we're interested in how the brain works, and we do experiments in a lot of different systems. I'm going to show you a little bit today of the kind of work that we do in the mouse. So this is in collaboration with Nick Sorafiu and Carl Svoboda, both at Janelia. And the mouse, in this case, is in a virtual tactile environment. So what that means is the mouse is running on a ball. And there are these two physical walls on either side of his face. And the walls are moving back and forth. And the movement of the walls is locked to the running of the animal. So he basically thinks he's in a virtual corridor, running around the burrow that the mouse usually would live in. Mice are not very visual animals, but they're extremely tactile with their whiskers. So that's how he's telling where the wall is. And he's basically in this environment and tracking the wall. So we can be watching his brain while we do these experiments and looking at the activity of neurons. In this case, these are neurons in the part of his brain that's basically encoding what's going on with his whiskers. So it's probably going to be encoding something about what the wall is doing. It's going to be helping him figure out sort of where he is in this virtual environment. So our setup for analyzing these data is that we have a source of data, in this case the brain. We're going to be doing streaming analysis on it, and then we're going to visualize the output. And for both of these things, we want to have feedback. So we want to be able to, based on what we're visualizing, actually change the analysis that we're doing. I'm going to show an example of that. And we also want to provide feedback on the experiment. So we want to either do the experiment differently, change something about the experiment, or we actually want to manipulate the brain. So we want to go in and either turn neurons on and off, or kill individual neurons, maybe based on particular functional properties. So in order to do that, we need to be analyzing the data on the fly. So this has, we've sort of been building out over the last several months an infrastructure for doing this that has a couple different components. So on the one hand, the first thing we have to do is just ingest and sort of sync the data. We have this interesting problem that we have data from a couple different sources that need to be exactly aligned in time, because we have the data from the brain, but then we also have his behavior, like how fast is the guy running on the ball. We have the analytics that we actually want to do. And then we have the need to visualize them. And we've actually been building a little controller app that's just written in Python that sort of brings all of these things together and gets them to talk to each other and makes it very easy for us at a very high level to sort of script the kinds of analyses we want to run and then change them on the fly and update on the fly and run them on the fly. So one example of an analysis we do, so we do some things that use those same algorithms I was talking about before. We've also come up with some algorithms that are very particular to our use case. So in this case, we're trying to estimate for individual neurons or individual responses the degree to which they're involved in or seem to be responding to a couple things about the animal's behavior, like where the walls were relative to his face, and also how fast he was running. And we can do streaming analyses to estimate these parameters, basically for every neuron, figure out to what degree was it encoding the position of the wall and to what degree was it encoding his running speed, and then use that over time to make a map. So on the left is the raw data that we're acquiring, and on the right is a map that's updating over time where the pixels now in this map are colored based on the relationship between the time series of neural activity at that location and the wall position of the walls relative to the animal. So we're using this algorithm to update those over time and then generating a map on the right that is now something we can basically look at right next to the microscope. So we used to just have the image on the left, and now we have the image on the right. And that now gives us new information about what's going on during this experiment and lets us manipulate it. And the last thing we want to start to be able to do, and really just beginning to think about how to do this, because it's really just sort of an interesting problem, is how do you actually update the kind of analysis you want to do on the fly based on the visualization. So if you're visualizing your data and you find something interesting, and now you actually want to do a different analysis but keep the whole thing running, so it's one streaming job, how do you go in and sort of programmatically update the analysis that you're doing? So we've actually been working on that by providing sort of updating parameters within our streaming application that can be updated based on inputs from a visualization. And we're using 0MQ to get these to talk to each other. So one really simple example is what I'm showing here, where on the left is a visualization where we're showing some updated parameter related to neural activity in the form of a map. And then it's actually a guy in my group, Andrew, with the mouse drawing little regions. And on the right is the result of an analysis that's extracting time series information from the regions that Andrew has specified, and is doing that by updating a streaming analysis on the fly based on the parameters it got from the way he's interacting with the visualization. So we're basically using these different pieces to talk to each other so that we can be doing more and more of our analysis on the fly. All right, so with that, I just want to thank you all for listening. I want to highlight the fact that a lot of this stuff you can find because it's all open source. We started using Spark back in 0.7, and the fact that it's open source and the way they've sort of just hugely supported the open source community has been amazing. So everything we're doing is trying to put it out there as well. The visualization project I described, Lightning, the analysis we do with our neural data is all open source, as well as some demos like the ones I was showing you are available as a Spark package. And finally, just to highlight the event that Paco mentioned at the beginning, Code Neuro, which we're doing here in New York City, which will be a combination of data science and neuroscience and a hackathon and Spark tutorials, is April 10th, so you can check it out at codeneuro.org. Thank you.
The mic. Oh, it seems it works. Cool. It seems that in your online learning algorithm, as you update points, you have a fixed steps of retraining steps. So it's basically remove 1 point, go through 10 iterations of k-means, remove 1 point, 10 iterations. Is that the case? Because I'm inferring that from only the visualization. Second, if that is the case, have you looked into doing that with a dynamic number of iterations? Basically, if you look at one point removes in terms of information, there's a boundary to the modification of the score that points can impact on your model. It's slightly different if you use regularization or not, but basically the idea is dynamic number of updates between every point update inside your data model.
That's a great question. We could happy to go into the details a little more offline. A top level answer is that it is doing a fixed number of iterations per batch, but you seem sad. However, the way that the half-life is parameterized, there's actually a concept of a time unit that can either be individual data points or batches. And by changing whether you're doing it based on batches or points, you can get the effective weighting to be very different. So you can either treat sort of each batch as a sort of individuated object on which updates will happen, or you can do it on a point-by-point basis. And if you have different numbers of points coming in different batches, they'll have very different behaviors. So there's some degree of control, but the actual literal number of iterations that take place, that's happening on a batch-by-batch basis, and that's fixed. But we could find a way to change it. Yeah, we can talk. Other questions?
Okay, we can take other questions offline then.
Cool.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. Wonderful.